It was a bright and sunny afternoon in a calm suburban neighborhood, where children often played along the sidewalks, couples strolled with their dogs, and joggers occasionally passed by. The peace of the day seemed unshakable. But for Officer Karen, a cop with more than 20 years of experience under her belt, it was just another routine shift. Little did she know, this day would unfold in ways she could never have imagined. Officer Karen had always taken pride in her instincts. After 25 years on the job, she had developed a knack for spotting trouble before it even started. Today, as she made her rounds through the neighborhood, something, or rather someone, caught her eye. A young girl, who couldn't have been older than 9, was riding a scooter down the sidewalk. The girl seemed lost in her own little world, enjoying the freedom of a sunny afternoon. But to Officer Karen, something about the situation felt off. "That girl, she looks suspicious," Officer Karen mumbled to herself as she narrowed her eyes. Edwin, a rookie officer fresh out of the academy, was taken aback. "Suspicious? She looks like she's 9 years old," he blurted out, unsure if he had heard her right. Officer Karen turned to him with an icy glare. "Listen, rookie," she snapped. "You're here to learn, not to question me. I've been doing this job for 25 years. I know when something's not right." Edwin hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He wanted to learn from Officer Karen, but something about this interaction felt wrong to him. He watched as Karen approached the girl, who had now stopped riding her scooter and seemed to be looking around, possibly trying to figure out where she was. "Sweetie, are you lost? What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Karen asked. Her voice carried a mix of suspicion and condescension. The girl, startled by the officer's sudden approach, looked up nervously. "I'm just riding my scooter. I live here," she replied, her voice shaky. "You live here? Is this your scooter? Where did you get it from?" Karen asked, her tone now sharper. "My daddy got it for me," the girl answered, her voice trembling a bit more now. "Where is your dad?" "You still haven't told me," Officer Karen pressed on. The girl pointed down the street. "He's at home," she said softly. But Officer Karen wasn't satisfied with her answers. In her mind, this wasn't just a harmless situation of a child playing outside. There was something else going on here, something that didn't add up. At least, that's what her gut was telling her, the same gut instinct that had kept her safe for decades. But was it truly her instinct speaking, or was it something more sinister? Something she wasn't even aware of? "What did I tell you? This is suspicious," Karen muttered to Edwin, who was now visibly uneasy. "I don't know, Officer Karen, she's just a kid." "She looks scared," Edwin tried to reason, his voice hesitant. But his words fell on deaf ears. "They start young," Karen muttered as she reached for her handcuffs. "Officer Karen, what are you doing? She's just a child." Edwin's voice rose in panic, but Karen didn't care. "Don't you dare question me again," she snapped coldly. Before the girl, whose name was Maya, could fully understand what was happening, Officer Karen grabbed her hands and forced them behind her back, snapping the handcuffs onto her tiny wrists. Maya let out a sharp cry as tears began streaming down her face. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," Officer Karen recited in a detached, mechanical voice. "Please, no. Let me go." Maya sobbed, struggling against the handcuffs, her small voice filled with fear. But her cries fell on deaf ears. Edwin stood frozen, horrified by what was happening in front of him. He knew deep down this was wrong, but fear of defying Officer Karen kept him rooted in place, unable to speak up. Karen roughly led Maya to the patrol car and shoved her into the back seat, her cries echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The bright afternoon sun that had once seemed so peaceful now felt harsh and cold. At the local police station, the atmosphere was anything but welcoming for a child, let alone a terrified 9-year-old girl. Maya was led inside, still in handcuffs, her small wrists aching. Officers and staff at the station looked on in shock and confusion as she was brought in. Whispers followed her, but no one stepped in to help. Maya was taken to a small holding cell, where she was left alone. Scared, confused, and still unsure of why she had been arrested, she sat on the cold metal bench, her tears falling freely. She cried for her father, her voice growing weaker with each passing minute, until exhaustion finally set in. The cell door clanged shut behind her, and the echo of it felt like the final blow to her already broken spirit. Time seemed to drag on endlessly. Maya had no way to tell how long she had been there. The unfamiliar sounds of the police station, the clatter of keys, the low murmur of voices, the occasional ringing of phones, only added to her confusion. Every minute felt like an eternity. The distant ring of phones and murmurs of the station only deepened Maya's fear. All she wanted was to be home, safe in her father's arms. But trapped in the cold, unforgiving cell, all she could do was wait. Meanwhile, Officer Karen sat at her desk, convinced that she had done the right thing. She busied herself filing a report, her confidence unshaken, until a fellow officer, curious about the young girl in the holding cell, approached her. "What did she do?" the officer asked, confused. "She was acting suspicious," Karen replied sharply. The officer looked at her in disbelief. "Suspicious? She's a child." Karen didn't respond, but the officer's words echoed in her mind. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. Had she been too hasty? Had her instincts betrayed her? But it was too late now, everything was already in motion. 2 hours passed before anyone thought to check the girl's identity. When they did, it took only moments to discover who her father was. The realization hit the station like a bolt of lightning. Maya was the daughter of Captain Alexander, a respected and high-ranking police officer. Panic rippled through the station as officers rushed to contact the captain. Meanwhile, Maya sat alone in the cold, gray cell, her tears having dried long ago, replaced by a deep, aching fear. At home, Captain Alexander had just finished a call when his phone rang again. Seeing the station's number, he picked up quickly. "Captain Alexander," he answered, his voice steady. "Sir, it's about your daughter," the officer on the other end began. "She's at the station." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean she's at the station? What happened?" he demanded. There was a long pause before the officer replied, "Sir, she was brought in by Officer Karen, there's been a mistake." Without waiting for more information, Captain Alexander grabbed his keys and rushed out of the house, his heart pounding. When he arrived at the station, chaos greeted him. Officers scurried about, trying to fix the situation, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his daughter huddled on a cold bench in a tiny cell. "Maya," he called, his voice cracking with emotion. Maya looked up, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "Daddy," she cried. Captain Alexander rushed to the cell and barked orders for it to be opened. In seconds, he was kneeling beside his daughter, pulling her into his arms. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm here now. You're safe," he whispered, but his heart broke as he saw the fear still lingering in her eyes. He stood and turned to the officers around him, his face dark with anger. "Who did this?" he demanded. The officers stepped aside, and Officer Karen approached, her face pale. "Captain. I'm sorry. I didn't know," she stammered. "You didn't know?" Captain Alexander's voice was cold, his fury barely under control. "You didn't think to ask? You arrested a 9-year-old girl, my daughter, and left her in a cell for hours. What made you think that was okay?" I thought she was suspicious," Karen replied, her voice faltering as she realized how flimsy her justification sounded. "Suspicious?" Captain Alexander repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "You let your biases blind you. And now my daughter is traumatized. She'll never forget this, and neither will I." Karen hung her head, knowing there was nothing she could say to undo the damage she had caused. "I'm so sorry, Captain," she whispered. "You will be," Captain Alexander responded firmly. "I want a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning. And don't think for a second that this won't have consequences." Karen nodded, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. Her once promising career was now hanging by a thread. Captain Alexander knelt back down beside Maya, gently pulling her into his arms again. "It's okay, sweetheart. "Daddy's here. You're safe now," he whispered. But he knew it would take more than his words to heal the hurt that had been inflicted. In the days that followed, the incident became a lightning rod for discussion within the community. Conversations about race, policing, and the dangers of implicit bias filled the air. Captain Alexander, a man who had dedicated his life to law enforcement, found himself in the middle of a much-needed dialogue, a conversation he knew should have happened long ago. He used the moment to speak out, to educate, and to push for change within the police department and beyond. As for Officer Karen, she was suspended pending an internal investigation. Once celebrated for her years of service, her career was now tainted by the shadow of her actions. She had spent her life serving and protecting, but in a single careless moment, she had become the very thing she had sworn to stand against. The little girl whose life she had upended would carry the scars of that day for a long time to come. Maya struggled to regain the innocence and carefree spirit she once had. The world had shown her a harsh and ugly side, far too early for her young age. Yet, with her father's love and unwavering support, she slowly began to heal. She realized her voice mattered, and her story had the power to spark change. The quiet suburban neighborhood where she lived was no longer the same after the incident. The illusion of peace had been shattered, revealing long-simmering tensions that had always lurked beneath the surface. But with that breaking came a glimmer of hope that the scars left behind could lead to a brighter, more just future. Days after the harrowing incident at the police station, Captain Alexander's anger had not subsided. The memory of seeing his daughter trembling in a cold jail cell, her innocent eyes filled with fear, haunted him relentlessly. He knew that Officer Karen's actions couldn't go unanswered. He needed justice, not only for his daughter but for all the children who might face such treatment in the future. Determined, he decided to take legal action against Officer Karen, seeking not just professional consequences but also a public reckoning for her actions. However, Karen wasn't the type of person to go down without a fight. As soon as she received the court summons, she wasted no time hiring the best lawyer in town. His name was Henry Marshall, a well-known and formidable attorney famous for his persuasive arguments and nearly unbeatable defense strategies. Marshall had built a reputation on winning even the most difficult cases, and when Karen walked into his office, he assured her he could do the same for her. "Captain Alexander might be powerful," Marshall said as they sat across from each other in his sleek, modern office, "but the law is on your side. You were doing your job, following protocol. This lawsuit is nothing more than an emotional reaction. We can win this." As the trial date approached, tension in the city reached new heights. The case attracted significant media attention, and the community became deeply divided. Some rallied behind Captain Alexander, understanding his plight as a father protecting his child. Others, however, believed that Officer Karen was merely doing her duty, even if the result had been tragic. In the courtroom, Marshall was a force to be reckoned with. He tore apart the prosecution's arguments one by one, presenting Karen as a diligent police officer who had followed standard procedure in a situation that, to her, seemed ambiguous. He brought in expert witnesses who testified about the difficulties police officers face and the importance of trusting their instincts, especially in potentially dangerous situations. Karen herself took the stand, her voice calm and unwavering as she recounted the events of that day. She emphasized that her only goal had been to protect the neighborhood. From his seat in the courtroom, Captain Alexander listened with clenched fists. The defense's narrative was so far from the truth as he saw it. Maya wasn't just a victim of unfortunate circumstances, she had been the target of Karen's biases. But the courtroom wasn't interested in what was morally right, it was focused on the legalities. And legally, Karen had a case. When the verdict was finally announced, it was not in Captain Alexander's favor. The court ruled that Officer Karen had acted within the boundaries of her duty. While the outcome was regrettable, she was not to be held legally responsible. The decision felt like a slap in the face. It dismissed the pain his daughter had endured, reducing the trauma to a mere professional mishap. The law had spoken, but it hadn't delivered justice. Despite the ruling, Captain Alexander was not the kind of man to accept defeat easily. The courtroom might have absolved Karen, but he had other ways of seeking retribution. He knew the law well, but he also understood the power of connections, especially those that extended beyond the reach of local courts. One evening, long after the trial had ended, Captain Alexander made his way to Karen's house. She lived alone in a modest home on the outskirts of town, a place that offered privacy and isolation. As he approached, the street was eerily quiet. Shadows stretched long and dark in the fading light. He didn't bother knocking. Instead, he waited in the dark, silently, until Karen finally stepped outside. When she did, his voice sliced through the night like a blade. "Karen," he called out, his tone low and ominous. Startled, Karen turned to face him. She could see the fury in his eyes, rage that had been building for weeks, anger that had nowhere else to go but toward her. Simmering fury that hadn't cooled since the trial clouded Captain Alexander's expression. "Captain," Karen replied cautiously, her hand instinctively moving toward her phone, though she knew it wouldn't offer much protection. "You might have won in court," Alexander began, stepping closer, his presence menacing. "But this isn't over. I have a very powerful friend, someone who doesn't take kindly to people who abuse their power and hide behind the law. He's the general director at the FBI." Karen's heart raced as she grasped what Alexander was implying. "You're threatening me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to stay composed. "It's not a threat, Karen," he said, his voice cold with certainty. "It's a promise. If I make one call, just one, your career as an officer will be over. You'll never work in law enforcement again. Hell, you might not even find work in this town or any town." Karen stared at him, her mind racing. She had dedicated her entire life to law enforcement, it was all she knew. But standing before this man whose power clearly extended far beyond her own, she felt her world unraveling. There was no way out. If Alexander made that call, her career, her reputation, everything would be ruined. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Simple," Alexander replied, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to cancel the countersuit you filed against me, and then you're going to resign from the force. Pack your things, leave town, and disappear. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." Karen knew she was trapped. There was no negotiating with Alexander, no bargaining her way out of this. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. Numbly, she nodded, unable to summon the strength to fight back. "Fine," she said, her voice hollow. "I'll do it." The next day, Karen followed through on her word. She withdrew the lawsuit against Captain Alexander, ending the legal battles between them. She handed in her resignation at the police station, avoiding the questioning gazes of her colleagues as she cleared out her desk. By the end of the week, she was gone. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't leave a forwarding address, she simply vanished, leaving behind the life she had built, the career she had dedicated herself to, and the city that had once been her home. No one knew where she went, and in time, people stopped asking. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered among officers, a warning about the dangers of crossing the wrong person and how quickly everything could be taken away. For Captain Alexander, the victory was bittersweet. He had sought justice for his daughter, and in his own way, he had achieved it. But there was no joy in his success, no satisfaction in seeing Karen driven away. The memory of Maya's tears, the image of her small, frightened face, stayed with him, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. In the end, the incident became a dark chapter in the city's history, a story of power, prejudice, and the lengths one man would go to protect his family. But it was also a story of a system that had failed to deliver true justice, a system that allowed biases to flourish unchecked, leaving innocent lives damaged in its wake. Karen was never seen or heard from again. Her departure was as quiet as it was final, a ghost fading into the background of a city that had already moved on. Captain Alexander continued his work, knowing that while he had won this battle, the war against injustice was far from over. As for Maya, she grew up knowing her father had done everything in his power to protect her. But she also learned that the world was a place where power often dictated the rules, for better or for worse. In the end, the story of a biased cop arresting a 9-year-old girl became more than just a headline, it became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for equality and justice, a painful story that carried within it the seeds of change.